The Legion of the Principate and the army of the Principate in general is in some respects the best known Roman army, or the best known period where we think we can understand how the army worked, how it was organized. Although we have some big problems. As mentioned earlier, there's no account equivalent to Caesar of this army in battle operating in the field. You get Josephus' account of the Jewish War, which is predominantly about sieges and skirmishes, so it's useful for that and very, very useful to have, but it doesn't tell us, we never see the army deploying for battle in the way Caesar's legions did so often. Tacitus has mentions, descriptions of quite a few different campaigns and battles, but never in that great detail. And you have tantalizing things like, from the 2nd century, Arrian's, the battle order against the Alans, of a formation that he planned to employ, though it's not entirely clear whether he actually got to fight a battle with them or even to challenge them to battle, or whether the Alans simply withdrew. But that is marvelous in its detail, but also it's hard to tell to what extent that is tailored around very specific circumstances, both of the tactical situation, the enemy he faced, and the nature of the army he had under his command. And of course, you've got Pseudo-Hyginus with his account of how the army could deploy into a camp and how much space would need to be occupied by the different elements of the army, all of which is marvelous, all of which is really useful. But it leaves a lot of questions unanswered. The bulk of the evidence we have for this period, the reason why we feel we understand this army in a way that we can't understand the structures of earlier and later, is the wealth of archaeological information. Now, you have different types that are provided by excavation. You've got particularly the physical remains of Roman army bases, forts for auxiliary cohorts, and the fortresses, the big bases that were designed to house, at least be the depot of an entire legion. Now, you can look at the structure, the way the barracks and the officers' houses, command structures, headquarters buildings, all this is laid out, and from that try to deduce the structure of the army. And from that, there's a danger, though, that you can get a little bit too rigid in that you can say, well, this is what it's built for, and then assume that that's what it always contained. When it comes down to it, a barrack block for a century of legionaries doesn't look that different from a barrack block for a century of auxiliaries. So who knows who's in there, and who knows how many rooms are occupied at any one time anyway, or how many barracks in a camp are fully occupied all the time, or even most of the time. We also have a wealth of epigraphy, inscriptions, associated with the army, and these come from people of all ranks. So you get senior officers talking about their careers, which units they've commanded and where, how they served, how senators rose through being a military tribune in one legion to commanding a legion somewhere else to commanding a province. And also a lot from ordinary soldiers, tombstones, altars, memorials of other sort, building inscriptions put up by a group of soldiers. We've completed work on this. The centurial inscriptions from Hadrian's Wall and elsewhere, the work done by the sentry under command of a certain man, or sometimes sentry of so-and-so in the cohort number whatever. And that gives you wonderful detail about how soldiers wished to present themselves, the sort of information they preserved, and they tended to commemorate themselves as soldiers. In the earlier days, people may have served in the army, may have had a distinguished record, but when they go home and die, they're just a Roman citizen, and they tend to be commemorated in that form, if at all. There are relatively few inscriptions from soldiers from the 1st century BC. It starts to pick up by the end of the century, and then it grows very, very quickly into the 1st, 2nd, and early 3rd centuries. That's where the bulk of information comes from. And some of these monuments may, if it's a tombstone, even depict the soldier, a sculpted version of himself. Cavalrymen often on horseback, trampling his opponents, but not always. Infantrymen often without armour, but sometimes with, standing in their ordinary uniform rather than battle uniform. They'll tell us about the unit in which they served, often in great detail. There's a sense of pride. Sometimes the titles will be listed. You have age at which they enlisted, length of service, age at which they died, decorations awarded, promotions awarded, rank achieved, this sort of thing. You have centurions talking about service in multiple legions dotted around the empire. You have dedications to particular gods and goddesses, local spirits. That might be done individually, might be done as a corporate thing by the unit or by a commanding officer on behalf of the unit. So you have that sort of information. You have the subliterary texts, Vindlander writing tablets, those from Carlisle are one of the more recent additions to this. We've had much longer papyri from Egypt, sometimes from Israel, from Syria, places like that, ostraca from North Africa, where you have military documents that are often very ordinary, almost mundane, but that tell you something about how units were organized, soldiers in service, what they were doing, where they were being sent, the duty roster of fatigues from Egypt, men being sent to watchtowers, men entering the camp, leaving the camp, coming back, details of pay, this sort of thing. So there is a wealth of information of a sort we don't possess for other eras of the Roman army. And there are reasons for that apart from mere chance of archaeological preservation. So in the one sense, this is an army that's very, very well documented. So this is an army that in many respects is very well documented. And when we come to the legion itself, these have much clearer identities and very long periods of existence compared to the earlier units, even compared to famous units like Caesar's 10th. And there are a number of 10th legions in the period of the Principate that will, presumably 10th Fretentis bears some relation to this earlier famous 10th Legion of Caesar's. But again, if you look at traditions and corporate identity in the British Army that's more than a little obsessed with this sort of thing, there can be breaks, there can be revivals, there can be amalgamations, and it can be confusing. But it is very interesting that the army that emerges as the Emperor Augustus sets it up on a more permanent footing is one where there are several numbers like first, second, third that are duplicated. And that presumably has to do with a very strong sense of identity within these units. They want to survive as the First Legion, the Second Legion, the Third Legion, and they don't want to give way to anybody else who might share that number. So this is something, this corporate identity, this sense of permanence has developed in the Civil War period in particular and in the 1st century BC, but it comes to fruition under Augustus. A lot of the army of the Principate is established and effectively created during the reign of Augustus, though not in a way that we can trace too clearly. And you can see this in many respects, but in the case of the Legion, it's most obvious in the emergence in the years following the Battle of Actium of eventually 28 permanent legions. Now this is a major break from the past and that tradition of every year the Senate deciding how many legions we're going to have next year, where they're going to be, and what the provincial commands are, therefore what level of magistrate will be in charge of each individual army. Augustus forgoes that. Instead, he establishes this is the number of legions which I think is right, this is what I need, and I'm not going to keep changing it every year. These armies will continue to exist, these legions will continue to exist, and as it turns out, some of them will exist for centuries, some of them well into late antiquity. The loss of 17, 18 and 19 in the disaster when Varus and 3 legions are wiped out by Arminius in the Teutoburg forest in AD 9 removes 3 from the list. For a while, the number drops down to 25. It will increase over the course of the 1st century and eventually be around about 30, and then it'll increase again by a few during the course of the 2nd century AD. Some units disappear during this time, new ones are created. And some are reformed or renamed, and some acquire different battle honours and the like. But essentially, the core of the army, of its legionary force, is established by Augustus and remains the same for centuries. And that idea that these legions will be permanent is new. You can see it as a development of what's been happening for quite a long time as legions last longer and develop more sense of a corporate self, of corporate identity, and the distinctions of things they've done. They earn battle honours. You know, Caesar's 10th Legion will get the nickname Equestras from the story that when he was going to meet Ariovistus, he put some of them on horses just to have a reliable bodyguard because he wasn't too sure about his allied cavalry. So nicknames, titles will appear and in some cases become permanent, in some cases get lost. And you have, the units that get the title Augusta, 9th Hispana, presumably that's from service in Spain at some point, we don't know when. We don't always know, and there is the tradition as well that Augustus removed the title Augusta from one legion that performed poorly. Others will get titles like Pier Fidelis, pious and faithful. Legio 14th Gemina, interesting name, Gemina the twin, presumably formed by the amalgamation of two other legions, presumably under Augustus, and this will, because of its success in Britain under Nero, defeating the rebellion of Boudica, gain the titles Martia Victrix. The martial or warlike from the War God Mars, and Victrix victorious. Valeria Victrix, 20th Legion, possibly from the same campaign. They were certainly involved in that campaign. So some units gain these titles, some, like 2nd Augusta, seem to plod along for centuries just being called 2nd Augusta, and that's enough for them. Or that's all they're going to get. So legions remain in existence. There is a lot less evidence on just how far they promoted traditions. You have glimpses in the sources. In the Civil War of 68-69, at one of the battles, Tacitus writes about a commander riding around the army and reminding the individual legions of past successes, some of which are recent, so they've been under Corbulo, for instance, in Nero's reign, therefore there might still be men who'd served under that commander might still be there, but others are referring to Mark Antony and things long ago. And if you look at the Feriale Juranum, the calendar, the list of festivals from Jura Europus, assuming it's military, and not everybody agrees with that, it's striking that you're getting not just commemorations of current emperors and their families and some of the more distinguished men from the past, but it's interesting to think that this 20th cohort of Palmyrians is celebrating the birthday of Germanicus, who was never an emperor, but who was a descendant of Augustus and very popular, and who dies whilst in the East in 200 years before, more than 200 years before. So you do have to wonder if this has come through some convoluted route, that perhaps the unit that helped organize the 20th Palmyrians when they were formed, because you get the impression, again, it comes in Tacitus, it's glimpses that instructors would come from elsewhere to set up a unit, to train the men right at the beginning. Perhaps they passed on elements of the traditions from their own units. So you have a legion that had served well and won distinction under Germanicus, it passes that on. Perhaps on several occasions, so it spreads through the army. We don't know. But we do know that men consider the identity of their unit important enough to record it on things like a tombstone. Even when they're a veteran, when they've left the army years before, they still very often want to say that I served in the 6th, the 10th, whatever it might be. And that's also true of auxiliary soldiers as well, but we're talking today about the legions. The auxilia is a topic we can discuss in another video on another day. So there is this great sense of permanence that Augustus establishes, and he may well have built on a trend in that direction, but this is a clear difference to what's happened before. The intention appears to be that these units will last for as long as the state requires them. Several will disappear. We've talked about 17, 18 and 19 and mentioned them already. Others will disappear, famously 9th Hispana. If you're British and my age group, you grew up watching, there was a very good BBC dramatisation of the Rosemary Sutcliffe's Eagle of the Ninth novel, all about the Ninth being destroyed up in Caledonia, what would become Scotland, and a son of its senior centurion going off to redeem the Legion's honour by retrieving the eagle that had been captured by the tribes. It's a great story. There was a movie more recently on it that didn't quite capture the feel to my mind, but was still quite fun in its way. So you have this sense where legions will disappear. We don't actually know what happened to the Ninth. All we know is that it's around in the early 2nd century AD, and it isn't around by the middle of the 2nd century AD. Other units also disappear. 5th Alaudi will go at some point. 21st Rapax will go. Units disappear. We hear of some being formally disbanded in disgrace when they backed the wrong side in a civil war, or being renamed. And we hear of units being formed, we hear of disasters, of heavy losses in conflicts in Britain late in Trajan's reign, in Hadrian's reign, in the Jewish rebellion, on the Danube at various times in the late 1st and 2nd centuries, whether it's the Sarmatians, the Dacians, or the Marcomannian, Quadian, people like that who are responsible. We don't have a clear case after AD 9 of a unit that's destroyed in battle and not reformed. And we don't quite know why the numbers 17, 18 and 19 were not used again. Presumably it's to do with them being considered unfortunate, nefas, unfavourable, unlucky. Whether it was because of the simple fact of defeat or whether it was because of perceived conduct of those units in the fighting that led to that defeat, so it's a disgrace, we don't really know. Scholars are very reluctant to admit the possibility that every now and again the emperor might simply have decided, well, I don't actually need that legion anymore, so let's disband it. There's no direct evidence for that happening, but then it's not impossible. And probably something like that does happen with some of the auxiliary units that seem to be relatively short-lived. But legions do disappear now and again and new ones are formed. And we don't know whether disgrace in battle was considered something that could require the permanent dissolution of the legion. Suetonius happens to tell us that 12th Fulminata loses its eagle in 66 AD when it's sent down to suppress the Jewish rebellion, and that expedition fails. The army retreats through the Bet Horon Pass and is harried by encouraged groups of rebels who've suddenly seen the great Roman army turning around and taking flight. But they're not disbanded. They will serve later on in the Jewish rebellion, although after the war they're not posted back to their billet in Syria but are sent to Cappadocia instead, and Josephus implies this is a reprimand of some form, but nevertheless they exist. So perhaps it depends on the circumstances. There are all sorts of factors that we simply don't have enough information about to understand how the Romans would have thought about this and how the emperor and his advisors actually made these decisions. But what we can say is that it has done at that level. Governors can't go around raising new legions of their own and forming them. And there are clear restrictions on how promotions, recruitment and things like this work and where legions are stationed. So moving a legion becomes a major concern. So there is that move towards a sense of permanence. You could still see the legions under Augustus as wintering in temporary bases before they go out in the spring to fight another war or to operate again or to maneuver and train. As the armies become more settled, as the frontiers become more settled, they build bases that become more and more comfortable. Timber structures get replaced with stone. They start adding amphitheatres outside the camps, big bathhouses, all this sort of thing, making them far more comfortable. And certain depots, legionary fortresses, will remain occupied, at least to some degree, for 200-300 years or more, and seem to be the base of the same legion in that time. But that doesn't necessarily mean that all or even the greater part of the legion is there most of the time. This, again, we'll do a talk at some point on forts, fortresses and army bases and just how we should understand them and look at them sometime in the future. So legions are permanent, the organisation is permanent. The basic structure of a legion we can be fairly confident about, but I have to emphasise the fairly. The Legion of the Principate appears to consist of 10 cohorts, numbered 1 to 10. For some legions, in some periods, the first cohort is larger than the others and numbers, in theory, about 800 men. And it's organised into 5 centuries, or at least has 5 centurions in charge of it, which that implies. Whereas all the others, 2 to 10, have 6 centurions and consist of a paper strength of 480. But this is deduced from some fairly small fragments of sources, and there might have been variations. So we have to be careful when we notice some peculiarity before we say that, well, this is something where the entire army has reformed and this is what everybody's doing. So for instance, you have 2 different types of legionary apparently within each cohort in the army in Cappadocia, mentioned by Arrian, mentioned by the satirist Lucian of Samosata. But is that just a local thing? And it appears to be to do with the shafted weapon with which they're armed, so that some may have the pilum and some may have a lancier or a lighter javelin. That seems to be the easiest way to understand it. But is that for local conditions because it works well there? Is it a peculiarity of those legions? They've just always done it that way. Or is it something that other legions might have adopted elsewhere? We don't really know. 10 cohorts of one of 800, one of 480, plus, at least in some occasions, 120 cavalry. Again, the numbers have to be pieced together from different sources. There isn't anybody who sets down this is what the legion was, apart from Vegetius, who writes around about the year 400 and tells us about the old legion and how it was organized, and his structure doesn't seem to fit with anything we know definitely from anywhere else. So there have been all sorts of debates about what he's referring to and just how many legions were organized like this, when, where, and for how long. But broadly speaking, 10 cohorts and a paper strength of a bit over 5,000 men seems right. Vegetius also tells us each cohort has a large stone throwing engine and each century has a smaller bolt shooter, so that would be 60 and 10 respectively. But again, where's that come from? The legions certainly deploy artillery when required, and again we get a sense of this corporate identity. Josephus singles out the 10th legion, 10th Fretensis, as having larger, more powerful, but better war engines than any of the others in legions that have come to the siege of Jerusalem. The same as elsewhere, he'll praise a detachment from the legions in Egypt, stationed near Alexandria, for holding out when others run away and outdoing those of greater reputation. But also this is a unit that's not serving in its entirety, that only has a vexillation, detachments there. So again, you have this strong sense of identity that keeps coming back again and again. So the legion can still be a tactical formation for large battles, but it is a big group of 5,000 or so men if it's anything like at full strength. Arrian, in his battle order against the Alans, divides his main infantry line into the bulk of it that's formed from one legion and the rest that's formed from a detachment, part of one other of the two that are in his provincial command. So legions can be used that way, but also part of a legion. So there's the impression that the command structure of a legion can be used even if only some of the troops are there, even if only some cohorts are actually present, which is entirely logical. But again, scholars can sometimes be a little too rigid when they don't look at these things from a practical point of view and say, well, how is this going to work? The legion now very definitely has a permanent commander of the legatus legionis, the legate in charge of the legion, assuming he's present, of course. Now, in Polybius' day, you had the 6 tribunes, pairs of whom take turns commanding the legion. In Caesar's day, very often he allocates a legatus or another senior officer to command each legion. But the implication is that this is just routine and what you do, but there isn't formally a post of commander of a legion in those days, that probably still the 6 tribunes are the senior officers, and perhaps they do still command in pairs as the tradition demanded. We're not really sure. They're clearly very important. They're mentioned again and again in Caesar's Concilia, his groups where he discusses the campaign, issues orders, and plans things. Makes the army work effectively. But by the imperial period, you have a definite commander, you have a senatorial tribune who is senior to the 5 equestrian tribunes. So we've got 6 altogether, but one is an aristocrat embarking on a senatorial career, and the others are men who've already commanded an auxiliary cohort before they get there, so have more military experience, at least to a degree. And you have the prefect of the camp, again a rank that goes back earlier but becomes sort of next most senior to the legate and the tribune. There are arguments over to who is the second in command. The orthodoxy has been that it's the tribune because of his social status, and then the prefect third. Some people have said, well, hang on a minute, does that make sense? Because the prefect's going to be a lot more experienced, because many of these people are former centurions, so they've been career officers, so they ought to know what's going on. We only really hear of prefects commanding legions occasionally. Famously, there's the man in charge of 2nd Augusta who wouldn't respond to Suetonius' order to join him for the final battle against Boudicca, so commits suicide afterwards to take the shame away from his legion. Egypt is an exception because you don't have legates, you don't have senators sent there at all, so these are commanded by prefects. But it's actually that somebody doing the same job just with a different title and with a slightly different social status. So again, there's that air of permanence. It's almost as if best practice from generations before is being brought together by Augustus into a new structure, a new drill book. Though again, there's so much we don't know. As I mentioned back in the talk about the army of the 1st century BC, we don't know at which point soldiers were banned from forming legal marriages. There's no evidence for that other than that it's in effect. So Augustus seems a likely candidate, but we can't be sure. And as I mentioned earlier, my suspicion is the main reason for this is partly about discipline, but more to do with responsibility. That the government basically doesn't want to pay. It doesn't want to be held responsible for the dependence of soldiers. So therefore, they're allowed to marry informally, as so many do, and the army, turns a blind eye to that, but it's not going to take any responsibility. If that soldier dies, then the family are on their own. Now, clearly, this is not what soldiers want, and hence the fact that over the generations, there's more and more pressure to allow them to make wills, to bequeath property to the widow, in inverted commas, that they weren't supposed to have, and the children that they weren't supposed to have. And also, those men who list their place of origin as incastries, born in the camp, who enlist in the army, presumably the sons of soldiers who, once they're old enough, just join up because they've grown up around the camp. So there's a lot that's going on that we don't really see, and our sources simply don't tell us that Augustus then decides to do this and do that. You get hints in successive sources, usually biographies of emperors, about them altering regulations for the army. There is a sense of standardization in terms of drill, equipment, training, all of these things. And you can see it reflected in Hadrian's speeches at Lambysis. How well imposed, how rigid all of this is harder to say. But probably, again, it's a little bit like military equipment. Now, Tacitus will say in a throwaway comment that in the confusion of one incident during the Civil War, legionaries end up with auxiliary equipment and vice versa, therefore making it clear there is a distinction, that you could tell this is what you should have, and in fact, that's not what you've got. It's probably the same sort of pattern we see, that if you look at the equipment of the army, you will see things that are recognizably Roman helmets, Roman swords, Roman body armor, Roman decorations, shield trappings, horsemen, and they're very similar. They are rarely identical in the sense we'd expect of mass-produced things in the present day, but then this is not a world of factory line, assembly line, mass production of that sort, where things can be absolutely identical, at least to all intents and purposes. So probably it's something where you have a lot of practices that are very, very similar, and recognizably this is what the Roman army does, but not necessarily 100% the same everywhere. And if you look at the layout of camps and bases, you get a sense of this going on, and this might be a way of sort of seeing the shadow of this gradual introduction of a standard way and an official army way of doing it, and a permanent way. This is going to be the regulation. This is how we're going to keep on doing it under Augustus and confirmed by his successors. So if you look at the camps that have started to turn up from Spain in some of them Second Punic War, and more from 2nd century BC and particularly 1st century BC, and then the ones that will turn up in Gaul, in Germany, when you look at the earlier bases, they are recognizably Roman army bases, but they don't follow that clear playing card shape that is familiar to us from, at least from the Western provinces, from the 1st century BC, 1st century AD and onwards. That's neat, that's tidy, that when we look at the layout of more permanent camps, they're very similar. Again, they're not identical, but they're really, really close. They're recognizably, this is the way the Roman army does things. In early on, there's a tendency, something again noted by Polybius, for the walls to fit the contours of the land rather more sensibly and practically, rather than imposing the stamp of this is what a Roman army base looks like, and we don't care where we build it, we're going to build it the same wherever we are. you look as if you can see traces of it becoming more and more standardized. And it particularly happens under Augustus, that they start to look more and more alike, they start to look neater and neater. And when you do get evidence for the internal organization, again, the layout of what a barrack block is has already looked like sort of rows and rows of tents joined together with a larger complex at one end, but it becomes far more of a standard pattern, and the range of sizes narrows down. So you still get, even with the permanent bases, it should be that you've got 10 contubernia in each century, therefore a barrack block of a century ought to have 10 pairs of rooms before you have the wider bit where you've got rooms for the centurion and perhaps for the principales, the senior officers. The problem is that you almost never get 10 pairs of rooms. You usually get more, very occasionally you get slightly fewer. So it's not as neat because real life and the army isn't as neat, but it is very recognizably, this is the Roman army's way of doing things. So the similarity between these layouts to the discussions of Hyginus, to the formal discussion of Polybius, where he's talking about how the tents should be laid out, that seems to come from being pretty close and pretty similar in the earlier days to becoming much more formal, much more neat, much more tidy. And that probably is a reflection of every other aspect of the army's behavior. It's again moving to a standard Roman army system, whether you're the army in Britain, the army in Gaul, the army in Syria. There are some peculiarities. You don't get playing card shaped camps and forts in the East very often at all. I mean, you could argue that some of the temporary siege camps do fit that, but there is a tendency that once you basically cross the Bosporus, that people think the natural shape for any camp is square. You might have rounded corners, just like the rounded corners of the playing card rectangular shapes in the West, but that's how an army base should be built, and that's how they build them. And the Roman army seems to fit into that tradition. So again, adaptation, it's not exactly the same. You feel that a Roman soldier could have gone from northern Britain to Syria and walked around an army base and felt he knows where he is, this is a base, but it wouldn't be exactly the same, but it'd be close enough that in the same way that, say, people in the US Army can move around their camps throughout the world, they're on familiar turf. There's something similar about it. It's basically the same. There is an army way of doing things and an army look to it all that, in the Roman case, crosses the empire, but it isn't identical and it isn't rigid. And some of that's just the reflection of distance. Some of it's the practical aspect. Why do things in a rigid way if there is a better way of adapting to the local environment? So the Legion in this period is more permanent, it's more organized, it's more standardized, but not absolutely 100%. And it might be that not all legions ever had the enlarged 800-man first cohort. Maybe not all of them just had 120 cavalry. Perhaps some had fewer, some had more. Not all of them had that Vegetius, what he says, the allocation of artillery. It would have varied according to the circumstances. You don't need a lot of artillery in some parts of the empire. It simply isn't a local requirement, other than as a defensive point of view for your base. But if there's nothing to besiege, nothing to knock down with artillery, you don't need a lot of artillery if you're going out to attack anybody. So the army has developed, it's become more professional, more permanent. But it's essentially the same. It's essentially a big Roman army that we know about. When we move into later antiquity, as the 3rd century develops, the development of the legion becomes far, far less clear than this. So when we've got problems earlier on, they become much greater. Some of the units will still exist, and some will be there, particularly amongst the Limitani, into the 5th century AD. One or two perhaps beyond that in the Byzantine army. But they don't seem to be the legions of Augustus's day or Trajan's day, and then why should they be? Times have changed, the society has changed, the military problems have changed, manpower training, all of these things, therefore the army adapts, as it always has done. The impression is of a reduction in size by the end of the 3rd century AD, and a great increase in numbers. So instead of having about 30 legions, you get 60 plus. But they're probably a lot smaller. But this is real guesswork. We know so little about the formal structure. This partly because the camps and bases built by the later army are far fewer in number, but much smaller, much not laid out in the same way. By the 4th century, the army is generally operating and being billeted in cities and towns over the winter. It isn't building big camps. It doesn't have the fortresses that have existed tend to fall into disrepair in that period. So there isn't this formal infrastructure of bases, training areas, granaries, supplies, all this sort of thing that we've had with the army of the Principate. At the same time, people stop commemorating themselves on inscriptions anywhere near so often. And we don't get those wonderful little insights into individuals' careers, into their beliefs, into their equipment. There's less evidence of all those things we've had for the early period as to what the army was like. And one of the problems is that there's also not very good literary evidence either to describe what it's doing. So glimpses from various sources have led to a consensus where we guess that by the 4th century, a legion is typically 1,000 to 1,200 men instead of supposedly 5,000 plus. But we don't really know. And when you see a legion listed amongst the Limitani in several bases, how big were those? Were those still substantial cohort-sized bases of several hundred men, or were they police stations, with a few dozen or fewer? We don't know. So the Roman legion will eventually disappear from history. Just like so many other aspects of the empire, it fades away. Especially in the West, it simply merges with what follows, and we can't say precisely when this stops being like that. But the legion itself, as an idea and a name, has a very, very long history just within the Roman context. And the influence of how it's done things is still there in Byzantine manuals in the Eastern Roman Empire for quite a long time, even when there aren't too many legions, units that are still called that anymore. And even when the emphasis on the heavy infantry soldier that had always dominated the legion, even if there had been other troops as well at various times, when that no longer becomes the mainstay of the Roman army, particularly the Roman army in open warfare, compared to earlier on. So things change and the legions appear to shrink, and they still have this corporate sense of identity, but only some of the old ones survive, and many of the others, largely because of the confusion within the Roman state, probably don't last as long. In terms of one reason why there's this proliferation in the number of legions, and at least a doubling in their numbers by the end of the 3rd century, is probably the impact of civil war. It has been very common throughout the Principate for legions to be sent off as vexellations, as detachments, to reinforce others, to operate independently, largely because the army's taken root, and it's often very difficult to send an entire legion off to war in a way that you could do in Caesar's day. So that meant they've got used to operating at different levels. When there's a civil war, when different parts of the empire end up supporting different emperors, you might find that one legion has detachments, vexellations under different authorities, under different emperors. And how that affects the command structure, promotions, whether each emperor is rewarding his own supporters with the higher ranks in, say, the centurionate, with tribunates, with all of these things. So you might get duplications. All of that will be going on because there's no longer a single central organization that's recording all of this, that's monitoring promotions, organizing how that happens. So there is a sense of dislocation of the state means that those permanent Augustan legions can't really survive in the way they were. And some of the legions that exist are probably quite short-lived, or end up changing their names, or being, if they're on the losing side in a civil war, being incorporated into the armies of the victors. We know so little about battlefield tactics that it's much harder to say how it's all working in later antiquity. There is an impression that it is much rarer for a Roman army to deploy in 3 lines, which was still probably the most common formation, certainly in Caesar's day and under the Principate, even if there are variations as well. There's still an emphasis on reserves, as there always has been in Roman military practice, but it's not quite so clear and neat and simple. Another development you get with the 4th century army and beyond is that some of these smaller legions, like the auxiliary cohorts and other units that are around at the time of various names and descriptions, tend to operate in pairs. So it's almost like a brigade of 2 units that again gives them a strength that's not the same as a big legion of 5,000, but if these units are of 1,000 or so, makes it more of a building block of a big army. But it may simply be that you don't need quite so often large chunks of 5,000 or so men, all with a coherent command structure to which you can bolt on auxiliary units as a major division within your army. The probability is that a lot of the operations are being fought by smaller field forces. Now that's probably always been common, but there had been cases earlier on where there are enemies you fight who require a big army, and a big army, it's useful to have larger subdivisions as well as the smaller ones. So there are many reasons why things change later on, but the eventual disappearance of the Legion and its shrinking in size is probably caused by lots of different factors. But it is much harder to trace. So it's, again, like so many things, we can see parts of this Roman institution at different times in Rome's history, but we don't really know how it comes to an end and how it changes. And we certainly can't always trace with any sort of confidence just why it's developing, why it's working in a different way, why it's being organized in a different way. So that's the end of our story for the moment. We've had a look at the Legion in different periods of Roman history. In the future, we'll do other talks about different aspects of the army, and then perhaps some more detailed and even longer ones. But that's for another day.